"Don't buy the horse, buy me instead!" That's what she shouted in front of the whole auction yard. A girl no one wanted, standing in the dust, cheeks red, voice shaking. Her father laughed, the crowd jeered, but one giant cowboy stepped forward with silver in his hand and a promise in his eyes. He thought he was saving her from a cruel bargain. But on the trail to his ranch, the wind carried whispers of something darker, a missing brother, a forged deed, and a mining camp willing to burn a man's life to ash. Snow's coming fast, hoofbeats pound in the night. The girl can cook and sew, but she can also fight when cornered. And the cowboy? He's about to find out saving her means taking on every hired gun in the hills. Your reactions remind me why these stories matter. If you still believe in the quiet power of love, justice, and truth, then you're part of the reason I keep sharing them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Trinidad horse auction yard as Luke Braddock made his way between the holding pens. His boots crunched on the frost-covered ground, and his breath came out in white puffs in the December air. The familiar scents of hair, horse sweat, and leather filled his nostrils as he moved purposefully through the crowd. Luke had come with a simple goal, to purchase a sturdy gelding for the demanding winter cattle work ahead. His experienced eye caught sight of a promising black horse, muscled and alert, standing in one of the nearby pens. The animal's coat gleamed despite the dusty surroundings, and its movements showed both strength and intelligence. As Luke approached the pen to get a better look, the unexpected happened. A young woman, no more than 20, suddenly stepped between him and the horse. Her clothes were worn but clean, and dust streaked her round face. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was a fierce dignity in her bearing that made Luke take notice. "Don't buy the horse," she announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet yard. "Buy me instead." The words hung in the crisp morning air for a moment before laughter erupted from the crowd. Luke's jaw tightened as he heard the cruel edge to their amusement. He studied the young woman's face, noting the desperation behind her defiant expression. A man's coarse laugh cut through the others. "She eats more than the mare!" The speaker stumbled forward. Her father, Luke realized with growing disgust. The man's eyes were bloodshot, and the smell of cheap whiskey clung to him like a cloud. The auctioneer, a thin man with a well-oiled mustache, tried to bring attention back to the sale. "Now, folks, let's get back to the bidding. Do I hear $20 for this fine gelding?" Luke didn't respond to the call for bids. Instead, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a $20 bill, the paper crisp between his calloused fingers. Without hesitation, he pressed it into the young woman's hand. Her eyes widened in surprise, and he noticed they were a clear brown, like spring water over stones. "This lady's under my protection now," Luke announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man used to being heard. The jeering crowd fell silent, their entertainment suddenly turned serious by his decisive action. The young woman stared at the money in her hand as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. Luke noticed her fingers trembling slightly, though whether from cold or emotion, he couldn't tell. "You can't do that!" her father bellowed, taking an unsteady step forward. "She's my daughter!" Luke turned slightly, positioning himself between the drunk man and the young woman. "Seems to me you gave up any right to call her that when you tried to trade her like livestock." His words were measured, but carried steel beneath their calm surface. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Braddock, surely you came here for a horse?" "I came here for honest business," Luke replied, "and I reckon I've found something more important." He turned to the young woman. "My wagon's just over there, miss. Would you care to join me?" She nodded, clutching the $20 close. As they walked away, her father's angry shouts followed them, but Luke kept his eyes forward, his stride steady. He could feel the stares of the crowd boring into his back, but years of making unpopular decisions had taught him to bear such scrutiny without flinching. The young woman walked beside him, her steps quick to match his longer stride. Though she said nothing, Luke could sense both relief and uncertainty radiating from her. The wagon came into view, a sturdy farm wagon with a team of bay horses hitched to it, their breath visible in the cold morning air. As they reached the wagon, Luke finally broke the silence. "I'm Luke Braddock," he said simply, offering his hand to help her up onto the seat. She hesitated just a moment before taking it. "Mabel Ellsworth," she replied, her voice steadier now. "And I thank you, Mr. Braddock." Luke nodded, noting how she settled herself on the wagon seat with careful dignity despite her circumstances. He climbed up beside her and took up the reins, aware that this morning had taken a turn he'd never expected when he'd ridden into Trinidad. The horses started forward at his gentle command, their hooves striking a steady rhythm on the packed earth. Behind them, the sounds of the auction yard grew fainter, but Luke knew that by nightfall, word of what had happened would spread across half the territory. He'd just upended both their lives in front of 24 witnesses, and there was no taking it back. As they left the auction yard behind, Luke glanced at his unexpected companion. Mabel sat straight-backed beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The morning sun caught the dust in her hair, turning it to a soft halo around her face. Despite everything, there was something unbroken about her spirit that spoke to him more than any fine horse could have. The wagon rolled on toward the open country, leaving Trinidad and its gossip behind. The winter wind whipped around them, carrying the promise of snow, but Luke had made his choice. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important decisions weren't the ones you planned for, but the ones that found you when you least expected them. Luke offered his hand to help Mabel into the wagon, his attention caught by the torn hem of her calico dress and the way her fingers remained tightly closed around the $20 bill. The fabric, though faded and worn, showed signs of careful mending, evidence of someone who took pride in making do with what little she had. The wagon creaked as they settled onto the wooden seat. Luke gathered the reins in his weathered hands, clicking softly to the horses. As they pulled away from the auction yard, the sound of hooves and iron-rimmed wheels crunching against the packed earth filled the morning air. "I'm much obliged to you, Mr. Braddock," Mabel said, her voice quiet but steady. She smoothed her skirts with one hand, the money still clutched tightly in the other. "But I want you to know I aim to earn my keep. I can cook real well, and my mending's strong enough to last through any kind of work. Whatever needs doing, I can manage it." Luke nodded, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "Ranch lies 2 days' ride up in the mountains," he explained. "Works hard, but there's always plenty of food on the table." He glanced at her briefly. "And it's just Luke, if you don't mind." The day passed slowly as they followed the winding trail northward. The December sun hung low in the sky, offering little warmth against the chill wind. Luke noticed how Mabel huddled deeper into her thin shawl, but made no complaint about the cold. As evening approached, he guided the wagon toward a sheltered spot near the Purgatoire River. The water rushed past dark and swift, its sound mixing with the whisper of bare cottonwood branches overhead. "We'll camp here tonight," Luke announced, bringing the wagon to a stop. He helped Mabel down, noting how she moved stiffly after the long day's ride. "River's good for washing up if you've a mind to. I'll get a fire going." While Mabel freshened up by the riverside, Luke efficiently set up their camp. He gathered wood and got a cheerful blaze crackling, then pulled his bedroll from the wagon. The thick wool blankets would keep out the worst of the night's chill. When Mabel returned, her face scrubbed clean and her hair smoothed back, Luke handed her a tin cup of hot coffee and motioned for her to sit near the fire. "Bedroll's yours tonight," he said simply. "I'll sleep under the wagon." "Oh, I couldn't." Mabel started to protest, but Luke shook his head. "Won't hear of anything else," he said firmly, stirring the beans he'd set to warm by the fire. "Nights get mighty cold up here." They ate their simple supper of beans and hardtack in comfortable silence. The firelight cast dancing shadows across their faces, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate. Luke noticed how Mabel stared into the flames, her expression distant and troubled. "My mama died 6 years back," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Fever took her quick, too quick for the doctor to help, even if we'd had money to pay one. She twisted her hands in her lap. After that, Papa started drinking more. Tommy, that's my younger brother, he tried to help keep things going, but he was just a boy himself. Luke listened quietly, adding another piece of wood to the fire. The flames crackled and sparked upward into the dark sky. Last spring, when the railroad crews came through. Mabel's voice caught slightly. Tommy got it in his head he could make good money working for them. He was 16 by then, good with figures. One morning he was just gone. She blinked hard. Papa said good riddance, but I know Tommy wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. Not to me. The pain in her voice made Luke's chest tighten. He'd seen how railroad companies could take advantage of young men, promising high wages but delivering debt and danger instead. After Tommy left, things got worse. Mabel continued. Papa started selling things off. Mama's china first, then the cow, then pieces of the farm. All for whiskey. She drew a shaky breath. When there wasn't anything left to sell except the house itself, he started looking at me different, like I was just another thing he owned. Luke's hands clenched involuntarily, but he kept his voice gentle. You're safe now, Miss Mabel. That's a promise. She nodded, wiping quickly at her eyes with the corner of her shawl. I believe you, she said softly. I don't know why, but I do. The fire popped loudly, sending up a shower of sparks. Luke rose and retrieved the bedroll, spreading it near the fire's warmth. Best get some rest, he said. We've got another long day ahead tomorrow. Mabel hesitated before settling into the bedroll. Thank you, she whispered, pulling the blankets close around her shoulders. Luke tipped his hat and made his way to his spot under the wagon. He arranged his saddle as a pillow and pulled his coat tighter against the growing chill. Above him, stars pricked through the darkness like distant lanterns. When morning came, frost had painted the grass silver white and rimed the wagon wheels with delicate crystals. Luke had coffee brewing before Mabel stirred, and he pretended not to notice when she quickly wiped tears from her cheeks as she folded his bedroll. The morning sun cast long shadows as Luke helped her back into the wagon. Her hand was cold in his, but her grip was stronger than the day before. As they started the slow climb toward the mountains, Luke found his protective instincts growing stronger. This young woman had endured more than anyone should have to, yet she hadn't let it break her spirit. The wagon wheels turned steadily, carrying them higher into the hills where Luke's ranch waited. Each rotation took them further from Trinidad and the life Mabel was leaving behind. But Luke knew the real journey. Earning her trust and helping her heal was just beginning. By late afternoon of their second day on the trail, the weather turned treacherous. Snow began drifting across their path like white veils in the wind. The temperature dropped steadily, and Mabel huddled deeper into the extra coat Luke had insisted she wear that morning. See those peaks there? Luke pointed toward jagged mountains that pierced the gray clouds. Ranch sits in the valley just beyond. He gestured to their right, where a thin column of smoke rose against the darkening sky. That's our chimney. Nate always keeps the fire burning strong when the weather turns. Mabel squinted through the swirling snow, trying to make out the shapes of buildings in the distance. The wagon wheels creaked as they navigated the winding trail, and she gripped the wooden seat tighter when they hit particularly rough patches. The sun was just touching the mountaintops when they finally rolled into the ranch yard. 3 men emerged from a nearby bunkhouse, their boots crunching in the fresh snow as they approached the wagon. The oldest among them, his silver hair visible beneath a well-worn hat, reached them first. "About time you got back, Luke," he called out, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Weather's fixing to turn nasty." His kind eyes settled on Mabel, curiosity evident in his expression. 2 younger men, probably in their 20s, hung back slightly, exchanging glances. Mabel felt her cheeks grow hot under their stares, and she fixed her gaze on her lap. Luke jumped down from the wagon and moved to help Mabel descend. "Nate, boys," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "This here's Miss Mabel. She'll be our guest for a spell." The simple introduction carried a weight that suggested no further questions would be welcomed. "Welcome to Braddock Ranch, miss," Nate said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm the cook around here, and general keeper of order when Luke's away." His easy manner helped ease some of the tension from Mabel's shoulders. "Much obliged," she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke gathered her small bundle of belongings and guided her toward the main house. The structure was larger than she'd expected, built of solid logs with a steep pitched roof to shed the mountain snows. Warm lamplight spilled from its windows, creating golden squares on the white ground. When Luke opened the door, Mabel stopped short in the threshold. The interior was nothing like she'd imagined. Instead of the sparse bachelor quarters she'd expected, she found herself in a well-ordered home. A pine table, polished smooth by years of use, dominated the main room. Copper pots hung in neat rows near the cook stove, and a shelf of books lined one wall. The smell of beef stew filled the air, making her stomach rumble despite her nervousness. "Nate keeps things running smooth," Luke explained, noting her surprise. "Man's a better housekeeper than most women I know." He set her bundle down and moved to stoke the fire in the large stone fireplace. Nate bustled in behind them, heading straight for the cook stove. "Stew's been simmering all day," he said, lifting the lid of a large pot. Nothing better for a cold night like this. The meal passed quietly, with Nate doing most of the talking. He spoke of ranch business, cattle counts and fence repairs, while serving up generous portions of stew thick with vegetables and tender meat. Mabel couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten her fill without worrying about having to make food stretch for days. After supper, Luke showed her to a small bedroom off the main room. "It ain't much," he said, lighting a lamp on the bedside table. "But it's warm and dry." Mabel stepped into the room, taking in the narrow bed with its quilted coverlet, the small chest of drawers, and the rag rug on the plank floor. A window looked out over the snow-covered yard, and thick curtains hung ready to block the night's chill. "It's perfect," she whispered, meaning it. After years of sleeping in a drafty loft, this room seemed like luxury itself. "Well then," Luke said, clearly uncomfortable with her emotion, "I'll bid you good night." He closed the door softly behind him. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Mabel lay awake, listening to the wind batter the shutters and watching shadows dance on the ceiling. The bed was soft, the blankets warm, but her mind wouldn't quiet. She'd escaped her father's cruelty, yes, but what had she traded it for? Luke seemed honorable, but she'd learned the hard way that men's kindness often came with hidden costs. The night hours crept by, marked by the ticking of a clock somewhere in the house and the occasional creak of timber as the wind gusted against the walls. Eventually, she must have drifted off, because the next thing she knew, pale dawn light was filtering through the curtains, and the aroma of fresh coffee drew her from beneath the warm quilts. Wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, Mabel made her way to the kitchen. Luke sat at the table, a steaming cup before him and a letter in his hands. His brow was furrowed deeply as he read, and something in his expression made her pause in the doorway. He looked up at her movement, quickly folding the letter and tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Morning," he said, rising to pour her a cup of coffee. "Sleep well?" But Mabel had seen the worry in his eyes before he could hide it, and she wondered what news that letter had brought to disturb the peace of this mountain morning. Luke stared at his coffee cup for a long moment, then reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew the letter. Without speaking, he smoothed it flat on the worn pine table and pushed it toward Mabel. She stepped closer, drawn by the official letterhead of the Territorial Land Office. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the paper. The words seemed to swim before her eyes. "Hereby notify you that the Silver Peak Mining Syndicate has filed claim to sections 12 through 17 of your registered grazing lands, comprising approximately 800 acres. Mabel's heart quickened as she read further. Claims supported by surveyor affidavits and deed of sale bearing the signature of one Thomas Ellsworth acting as authorized agent. The coffee cup slipped from her other hand, clattering against the table. Dark liquid splashed across the wooden surface, but neither of them moved to wipe it up. Thomas Ellsworth. Tommy. Her brother's name stared up at her from the official document, and she felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas Ellsworth? Luke said quietly. Not quite a question. Any relation? Mabel sank into the chair across from him, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. My brother, she whispered. Tommy, but I don't understand. He's only 16. He can't be an authorized agent of anything. Luke's expression remained carefully neutral. When's the last time you saw him? Spring, Mabel said, twisting her hands in her lap, when the railroad crews came through. He'd been doing odd jobs for them, running messages, helping in their office. He was good with numbers, always has been. She swallowed hard. One morning he was just gone. Left a note saying he'd found real work, would send money when he could. But he never did. And you think he might be in trouble now? Mabel looked up, surprised by the gentle concern in Luke's voice. There was no accusation there, no anger that her brother might be involved in stealing his land. I don't know, she admitted. Tommy's smart, but he's also proud and desperate to prove himself if someone offered him what seemed like honest work. She trailed off, remembering how eager Tommy had been to earn his own way, to be seen as a man instead of a boy. Luke pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. I need to ride to town, he said, reaching for his coat. Telegraph office opens at 8 o'clock. Maybe the land office can give us more details about this claim. Us? Mabel echoed softly. Luke paused in the act of pulling on his coat. Unless you'd rather not be involved. No, I want to help, she said quickly. I need to know what Tommy's gotten himself into. And... She hesitated, then lifted her chin. And I want to earn my keep here, while we wait for answers. I'm good at cooking, mending, whatever needs doing. A ghost of a smile touched Luke's lips. Talk to Nate about the kitchen. He's particular about his domain, but he mentioned last night that an extra pair of hands wouldn't go amiss. The morning passed slowly after Luke rode out. Mabel found Nate in the kitchen, up to his elbows in flour. The old cook eyed her thoughtfully, then nodded at a clean apron hanging by the door. Reckon you know anything about bread making? He asked. Some, Mabel admitted, though we usually couldn't afford much flour. Well then. Nate gestured to the workspace beside him. No time like the present to learn proper. Bunch of hungry cowboys need feeding, and good bread's the foundation of every meal. Under Nate's patient instruction, Mabel learned the rhythm of kneading dough, working it until it felt alive under her hands. The physical activity helped keep her mind from spinning with worry about Tommy, though she couldn't completely shake the sick feeling in her stomach. Whatever's troubling you, Nate said as they shaped the dough into loaves. It'll seem clearer after it's had time to rise, just like bread. Mabel managed a small smile at the comparison. I hope you're right. The short winter day was drawing to a close when they heard hoofbeats in the yard. Mabel hurried to the window, watching as Luke dismounted and led his horse toward the barn. His shoulders looked weary, and she knew before he entered that he didn't have good news. Telegraph office sent the message, he reported, hanging his coat by the door. But they say it could be days before we get a reply. Weather's bad between here and Denver, and lines are down in places. Mabel nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. The waiting would be hard, but at least here she had work to keep her hands busy. The smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen, and she took comfort in knowing she'd contributed something useful to the household. Smells like you and Nate had a productive day, Luke observed, warming his hands by the stove. The girls are natural with dough, Nate called from where he was stirring a pot of beans. Quick learner, too. Luke's eyes met Mabel's across the kitchen, and she saw something like approval there. "Good," he said simply. "We'll need all hands working together, especially now." The evening settled around them, quiet but for the wind rattling the windows and the homey sounds of supper being prepared. Mabel felt the weight of uncertainty about Tommy pressing against her heart. But here in this warm kitchen, surrounded by the simple industry of ranch life, she found a measure of peace. Whatever tomorrow's telegram might bring, she wasn't facing it alone. 3 days crawled by like molasses in winter. Mabel kept her hands busy in the kitchen with Nate, learning the rhythms of ranch cooking, while Luke tended to essential repairs before the weather turned worse. The waiting felt like a physical weight on her shoulders, growing heavier with each sunset. On the morning of the 3rd day, Luke rode out early to check the telegraph office. Mabel watched from the kitchen window as his horse disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, her fingers absently kneading bread dough. The sound of hoofbeats returned just after noon, when the weak winter sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks. Luke's expression was grim as he stepped into the warm kitchen, shaking snow from his coat. Without a word, he pulled a yellow telegram from his pocket and handed it to Mabel. Her flour-covered fingers left smudges on the paper as she read, "Deed signed, Pueblo Stop Witness, Mining Foreman Caleb Rusk. Stop claim filed through proper channels. Stop." "Pueblo," Mabel whispered, her heart pounding. "That's where the railroad office was, where Tommy worked last spring." "This Rusk fellow," Luke said carefully. "He's known for acquiring land claims for the mining syndicate. Not always by honest means." Mabel's chin lifted defiantly. "Tommy wouldn't betray me, or help steal someone's land. He's not like that." Luke studied her face for a long moment. "I believe you care for your brother," he said finally. "But we need more than faith right now. We need proof." He moved to warm his hands by the cook stove, his shoulders tight with tension. "I need to make a supply run to town tomorrow. Flour's running low, and we're nearly out of coffee." He glanced at her. "You're welcome to come along if you'd like. Might do you good to get off the ranch for a spell." Mabel nodded, grateful for the chance to feel useful. "I know what to look for in the dry goods," she offered, "and I can help carry." The next morning dawned clear but bitter cold. Luke helped Mabel into the wagon, tucking heavy blankets around her legs. The descent from the ranch was treacherous, with ice glazing the switchbacks. Luke handled the reins with careful precision, keeping the horses steady on the narrow track. "Watch that corner," Mabel warned as they approached a particularly sharp bend. "There's black ice under that powder snow." Luke's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've got a good eye." "Had to learn," she said quietly. "Father wasn't always steady when driving the wagon." They reached town by mid-morning. The mercantile was warm after the long, cold ride, and Mabel quickly lost herself in the familiar task of selecting supplies. She ran practiced fingers through bins of dried beans, checking for stones and withered pods. The coffee she chose was freshly ground, its rich aroma filling the air. Each item she selected was measured carefully against both quality and cost. Habits learned through years of stretching thin resources. Luke stood at the counter with Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, tallying their purchases. Mabel was examining the flour sacks when rough laughter from the back of the store caught her attention. 2 miners stood near the tobacco counter, their clothes dust-covered and their boots caked with mud. "That fat girl's brother," one said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet store. "Yeah, I seen him up at the assay office. Smart kid, keeping things legal for Rusk." "Legal enough," the other chuckled. "Long as the papers look right, ain't nobody asking questions about where they came from." Mabel's hands trembled on the flour sack. She set it down carefully, not wanting to draw attention, and slipped toward the front of the store. Luke looked up as she approached, something in her face making him straighten. "I need some air," she managed to say quietly. Luke nodded to Mr. Peterson. "We'll settle up in a moment," he said, following Mabel outside. The cold air helped clear her head, but couldn't stop the racing of her heart. She told Luke what she'd overheard, watching his jaw tighten as she repeated the miner's words. "The assay office," he said thoughtfully. "That's where they measure ore samples, determine their value. Also where a lot of paper gets pushed around. Deeds, claims, transfers." "Tommy's good with numbers," Mabel said. "And papers. But Luke, he couldn't know what he was really doing. This Rusk person must have tricked him somehow." Luke was quiet for a long moment, watching snow drift across the street. "We need to find out exactly what's happening in that mining camp," he said finally. "But first we need to secure the ranch for winter. 2 days of work should do it." He looked at her steadily. "Then we'll go find your brother." Mabel nodded, grateful beyond words for his help. They finished their business at the mercantile quickly, Luke's manner perfectly casual as they passed the 2 miners. But Mabel noticed how his hand stayed near his gun belt, and how his eyes tracked their movements until they left the store. The ride back to the ranch was slower, the wagon heavy with supplies. Mabel huddled under the blankets, her mind spinning with thoughts of Tommy. He was alive. That knowledge alone lifted a weight she'd carried for months. But the rest? What had this Rusk person convinced him to do? And how could they prove it before Luke lost his land? The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. As Luke helped her down from the wagon, his hand warm and steady on her arm, Mabel made a silent promise to her brother. She would find him. She would help him make things right. Whatever it took, she would not let him be lost to her again. Dawn painted the ranch in shades of pearl and gold as Luke stepped onto the front porch, 2 steaming coffee cups in his weathered hands. He found Mabel already at work, hefting feed sacks from the barn to the storage shed. Her cheeks were flushed with effort in the crisp morning air. "You don't need to do that," he called, setting the cups on the porch rail. "There's plenty else needs doing." Mabel straightened, brushing dust from her apron. "These sacks won't move themselves," she said matter-of-factly. "And winter's coming." Luke watched her lift another sack, noting how she'd already learned to balance the weight against her hip. "At least take some coffee first," he insisted. They shared a quiet moment on the porch, steam rising from their cups. The mountains loomed sharp and clear against the morning sky, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "Fence line needs mending before we go," Luke said finally. "North pasture where the creek runs through. Can't leave the cattle wandering while we're gone." Mabel nodded. "I'll pack us some biscuits for the work." The morning passed in steady labor. Luke worked the fence line, replacing rotted posts and stretching new wire, while Mabel brought supplies from his wagon. Despite his continued protests, she insisted on helping carry the heavier loads. "Been doing work like this since I was 12, she told him firmly. "Won't break me now." By midday, they'd moved to the hay barn, securing loose boards and patching holes in the roof. Luke showed Mabel how to check the support beams, explaining how heavy snow could collapse a weak spot. "Tommy and I used to help with barn work," she said softly, running her hand along a rough-hewn beam. Before everything changed." Luke didn't press her for details. Instead, he showed her how to wedge a support brace just so, making sure it would hold through the winter storms. As evening approached, they gathered around the kitchen table. Nate had left a pot of beans simmering on the stove, with cornbread warming beside it. Luke spread out a rough map on the table, weighted down with his coffee cup. "Mining camps here," he said, pointing to a spot near a series of creek beds. "Day's ride west, up in the hills. Creek's mostly frozen this time of year, but we'll need to cross careful like." Mabel studied the map intently. "What should I expect?" "Rough place," Luke said honestly. "Lot of men living hard lives, chasing dreams of silver. Some honest, some not so much." He looked at her steadily. "Stay close to me when we get there." She nodded, then rose to gather provisions for their journey. Luke watched as she moved purposefully through the kitchen, selecting jerky and hard bread, wrapping everything carefully in oilcloth. She found a small coffee pot and tied it to a pack with practiced hands. "Done this before?" he asked. "Packed for Tommy's hunting trips," she replied, not looking up. "He always forgot something if I didn't help." Later, after Mabel had gone to her room, Luke sat at his desk cleaning his weapons. He oiled the rifle first, working the action smooth, then moved on to his Colt revolver. Both were single action, reliable but slow to fire. He hoped they wouldn't be needed. A floorboard creaked, and he looked up to find Mabel in the doorway. "Should I bring a weapon?" she asked quietly. Luke considered for a moment. "You know how to shoot?" "Papa taught us both, before. He nodded slowly. "I've got a spare revolver. Show you how to use it in the morning. Single action, like mine." First light found them in the stable, saddling their horses. Luke helped Mabel mount his calm mare, Sarah, while he took his own stallion. The morning was grey and cold, their breath forming clouds in the still air. Old Nate stood in the doorway, watching them prepare. "Mind that weather," he warned, pointing to gathering clouds in the west. "Storm's coming, sure as sunrise." They rode out as dawn was breaking, following game trails through the pines. Luke set an easy pace, mindful of Mabel's less experienced riding. She sat her horse well enough, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. By midday they reached the creek. Ice rimmed its banks, and the water ran dark and swift between them. Luke dismounted to test the ford, breaking through thin ice to probe the bottom with a branch. "We'll cross here," he decided. "Water's shallow, but watch for loose rocks." Mabel guided Sarah carefully into the stream, following Luke's lead. The mare picked her way across surely, but Mabel gasped as icy water splashed above her boots. They made camp under a stand of spruce trees, the branches offering some shelter from the wind. While Luke gathered firewood, Mabel laid out their simple meal of jerky and bread. The coffee pot soon bubbled at the edge of their small fire. As they ate, Mabel finally asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. "Why did you do it?" she said softly. "Spend $20 on a stranger." Luke stared into the flames for a long moment. "Some things a man can't let stand," he said finally, his voice low but firm. Mabel waited, but he offered nothing more. The fire crackled between them, throwing shadows against the spruce boughs as the afternoon light began to fade. The mining camp appeared through the trees as the sun slanted toward the western peaks. Weathered shacks and tents sprawled across the hillside, smoke rising from dozens of chimneys. The sharp smell of coal fires mixed with the sour reek of spilled whiskey and unwashed men. Luke reined his horse to a stop at the camp's edge, beneath a towering pine. "Best leave the horses here," he said quietly. "Less chance of trouble." Mabel nodded, her face pale but determined as she dismounted. Her boots crunched on frozen pine needles as Luke helped her down. They tied the horses in a sheltered spot where Sarah and Luke's stallion could browse on tufts of winter grass. "Stay here with them," Luke instructed, checking his revolver was secure at his hip. "I'll find Tommy first, make sure things are safe." "But he's my brother," Mabel protested, her voice catching. "I should—" "Please," Luke cut in gently. "Let me talk to him first. Promise you'll wait?" She wrapped her arms around herself, nodding reluctantly. Luke squeezed her shoulder once, then strode toward the cluster of buildings. The assay office wasn't hard to find. It was one of the few proper buildings, with glass windows and a painted sign. A pot-bellied stove in the corner filled the room with smoky warmth. Behind a scarred desk, a lean young man bent over leather-bound ledgers, his pen scratching steadily. Luke's boots on the plank floor made Tommy look up. Recognition flashed across his face, followed quickly by confusion and something like fear. "Mr. Braddock?" Tommy straightened, his voice uncertain. "What brings you up here?" "Think you know why I'm here?" Luke said evenly. "That deed with your signature on it, the one claiming half my grazing land. Care to explain? Tommy's face hardened. It's all legal. You agreed to sell that section for the mining operation. Mr. Rusk showed me the papers himself. That's a lie, boy, and you know it. Luke kept his voice level, but his eyes were steel. Never agreed to sell an acre. Those papers are forged. You calling me a liar? Tommy's chin lifted defiantly, but his hands trembled slightly as he closed the ledger. I saw the agreement. Mr. Rusk wouldn't. Tommy? Mabel's voice from the doorway made them both turn. She stood there, shivering, tears already spilling down her cheeks. Her brother's face went slack with shock. Mabel, Tommy whispered. What are you? How did you? Please come home, she choked out, taking a step forward. Papa's gone to drink and I've been so worried, and now this with the land. She gestured helplessly. What are you doing here? Tommy's expression shuttered. I've got steady work here, good pay. Mr. Rusk says I could be running the office in a year or two. He wouldn't meet her eyes. I'm not going back to scraping by, watching Pa drink away everything we earn. But the deed, Mabel started, is perfectly legitimate. A new voice cut in smoothly. A tall man filled the doorway behind Mabel, his hard eyes taking in the scene. His clothes were fine but trail-worn, and a heavy revolver rode low on his hip. Mr. Rusk. Tommy straightened further, relief evident in his voice. Everything all right here, Tommy? Rusk's tone was friendly, but his gaze never left Luke. This gentleman giving you trouble? Just having a discussion about some paperwork. Luke said carefully. He shifted slightly, angling himself between Rusk and Mabel. Ah, yes, the grazing rights. Rusk's smile didn't reach his eyes. All properly filed with the territorial office. Perhaps you'd like to examine the documents? Perhaps I would. Another time. Rusk's voice hardened. Right now, I think it's best you leave before any trouble starts. Mining camps can be dangerous places after dark. Luke felt Mabel's hand clutch at his sleeve. He covered it briefly with his own, never taking his eyes off Rusk. Tommy. Mabel tried one more time. Please. But her brother had already turned away, shoulders rigid as he bent over his ledgers again. Good evening, Mr. Braddock, Rusk said pointedly. Miss. He tipped his hat to Mabel with exaggerated courtesy. Luke backed carefully towards the door, keeping himself between Mabel and the others until they were outside. The camp was growing rowdy as night approached, harsh laughter and the clinking of bottles drifting from the nearby saloon. Come on, Luke murmured, guiding Mabel with a gentle hand on her elbow. Let's get clear of here. They retrieved the horses and rode a mile out, finding a sheltered hollow where two ridges met. Luke built a small fire while Mabel sat silent, staring into nothing. Her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. We'll come back, Luke promised quietly as he spread his coat around her trembling form. We'll find a way to prove the truth. Mabel didn't respond. She just pulled the coat tighter and continued to stare into the darkness, tears gleaming in the firelight. Above them, the stars emerged one by one, cold and distant in the winter sky. The sound of the mining camp was lost in the whisper of wind through the pines, but its shadow seemed to stretch across the miles between, dark and heavy with unspoken threats. The pale winter dawn crept over the eastern ridges, painting the frost-covered ground in shades of pearl and silver. Luke stood at the edge of their small camp, stamping his boots quietly to ward off the morning chill. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp air as he scanned the surrounding terrain. A flash of movement caught his eye. Riders, 3 of them, winding through the pines below. Even at this distance, he recognized Rusk's broad-shouldered form leading them. Mabel, he called softly, not taking his eyes off the approaching men. Time to go. She was up instantly, reading the urgency in his tone. They broke camp swiftly, scattering the ashes of their fire and saddling the horses with practiced motions. Within minutes, they were mounted and moving. Luke led them up a narrow deer trail that switchbacked through dense timber. The path was treacherous with ice, forcing them to move slowly, but it offered better cover than the main trail. Mabel's mare picked her way carefully, hooves crunching softly on frozen leaves. "Will they follow?" she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Probably," Luke answered. "But they don't know these back trails like I do." They rode steadily through the morning, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and share some jerky and water. The sun climbed higher, but the day remained bitter cold. By mid-afternoon, Luke's prediction proved true. There was no sign of pursuit. Dusk was falling when they finally caught sight of the ranch house, its windows glowing warmly in the gathering darkness. The horses' heads dropped wearily as they crossed the yard. Old Nate emerged from the barn, his weathered face creasing with concern at their early return. "Trouble?" he asked simply, moving to take their mounts. Luke nodded. "Keep an eye out. Might have visitors." Inside, Mabel sank into a kitchen chair, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. The memory of Tommy's closed-off face, his stubborn refusal to listen, seemed to weigh on her shoulders like a physical burden. "Here." Luke pressed a cup of hot coffee into her hands. "You need this." "He wouldn't even look at me," she said softly, staring into the dark liquid. "My own brother." "Something's not right there," Luke replied, settling into the chair across from her. "Tommy's scared of something, or someone. Did you see how his hands were shaking?" "Rusk." Mabel spat the name. The way Tommy looked to him, like he was waiting for permission to breathe. Luke nodded slowly. "Men like Rusk, they know how to get their hooks into young folks. Promise them everything they're hungry for: respect, security, belonging. Then use those promises like rope to bind them." Over the next week, life settled into a cautious rhythm. Mabel threw herself into ranch work with fierce determination, as if keeping busy could keep worry at bay. She rose before dawn to help Nate with breakfast, learned to make coffee strong enough to satisfy even the pickiest cowboys, and spent afternoons mending torn shirts and worn harness leather. The ranch hands warmed to her quickly, especially after tasting her light, flaky biscuits. Even Nate, who'd been cooking for cow camps for 30 years, had to admit she had a gift. "Lord above, girl," he declared one morning, breaking open a steaming biscuit. "These ain't food, they're pure magic." His exaggerated praise startled a laugh from Mabel, her first real laugh since the mining camp. Luke spent his days riding fence lines and checking on winter-scattered cattle, always alert for signs they were being watched. Sometimes he caught glimpses of dust on distant ridges, suggesting riders moving parallel to his route. He kept his rifle close and made sure never to follow the same pattern 2 days running. The nights were the hardest. After supper, when the hands retired to the bunkhouse, the big ranch house grew quiet except for the crack and pop of the fire. Luke and Mabel often sat in the kitchen, sharing coffee and the weight of worried silence. One particularly cold evening, as frost patterns spread across the window panes, Luke set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "Been thinking about Tommy," he said quietly. Mabel looked up from her mending, needle poised mid-stitch. The way he acted, the things he wouldn't say. Luke chose his words carefully. "I've seen it before, when men use threats to keep their hold on someone. Sometimes it's not just their own safety they're worried about." "You think Rusk is threatening him?" Mabel's hands tightened on her sewing. "Could be. Maybe threatening you even. Tommy's young, alone. Easy to convince him that crossing Rusk might bring trouble down on his sister." Mabel's face hardened with sudden resolve. "Then we have to get him out. I don't care what it takes." Luke studied her across the lamplight, seeing not the uncertain girl from the auction yard, but a woman with steel in her spine. "Could be dangerous," he warned. "He's my brother," she said simply. "My only family worth claiming. I won't leave him there." Luke nodded slowly. "Then we'll find a way, whatever it takes." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind keened around the eaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. But in the warm kitchen, something stronger than winter's chill had taken root, a shared determination that would not be shaken. A week of anxious waiting had worn on them all. The morning dawned clear and cold as Luke and Mabel set out for town once more, frost crunching under their horses' hooves. The December sun cast long shadows across the trail, barely warming the crisp mountain air. "Might learn something at Miller's livery," Luke said as they rode into the small town. "Sam Miller hears everything worth knowing around here." The livery stable's weathered boards seemed to sag under their coating of frost. Inside, the familiar scents of hay and leather wrapped around them. Sam Miller, bent and greying but sharp-eyed as ever, looked up from curry-combing a bay mare. "Luke Braddock." He nodded, then tipped his hat to Mabel. "Ma'am, any news worth sharing, Sam?" Luke asked, leading their horses to empty stalls. The old man's face creased thoughtfully. "Matter of fact, there is. That young fellow from the assay office, Tommy Ellsworth, quit sudden-like 3 days back." Mabel's breath caught. Luke's hand stilled on his saddle strap. "Gone with that mining foreman, Rusk?" Sam continued, working his brush in steady strokes. "Seen 'em headed up toward the old Silver Road yesterday morning. Carrying surveying gear, looked like." Luke and Mabel exchanged glances. The old Silver Road led through some of the richest unclaimed land in the territory, including the western edge of Luke's range. "Much obliged, Sam," Luke said, dropping an extra quarter on the stable bench. They walked out into the pale winter sunshine, boots ringing on the frozen ground. "He's going to do it again," Mabel whispered. "Help them steal more land with false papers." Luke's jaw tightened. "Not this time." He strode toward the telegraph office, Mabel hurrying to keep up. Inside the small office, the telegraph key clicked steadily as Luke wrote out their message to the United States Marshal in Las Animas. His pencil moved deliberately across the paper. "Evidence of land deed forgery stop mining syndicate led by Foreman Rusk using coerced witness. Thomas Ellsworth, stop request, immediate investigation. Stop Luke Braddock Rancher, Trinidad Territory." The operator counted out the words, named his price. Luke paid without hesitation. "How long for a reply?" Mabel asked as they stepped back onto the street. "Could be days," Luke admitted. "Marshal Hart's territory stretches clear to the Kansas line." The sun was setting by then, painting the mountain peaks in shades of purple and gold. The boarding house windows glowed warmly against the gathering dusk. Inside, the landlady, a thin woman with kind eyes, showed them to their separate quarters. Luke to a narrow bunk room shared with 3 other men, Mabel to a curtained cubicle in the women's section. "Sleep well, Miss Ellsworth," Luke said formally, mindful of watching eyes. Mabel nodded, disappearing behind her curtain. Through the thin fabric, she could hear the other women preparing for bed, their whispered conversations and rustle of clothing. Sleep came slowly, her thoughts full of Tommy and what tomorrow might bring. Dawn broke grey and cold. They ate a quick breakfast of coffee and cornbread, then saddled up for the ride home. The morning air bit at their faces as they followed the familiar trail into the mountains. They were halfway home when Luke reined in sharply, standing in his stirrups. "Smoke," he said, voice tight with alarm. Mabel looked where he pointed. Against the pale winter sky, a column of dark smoke rose from the direction of the ranch. "Ride!" Luke commanded, spurring his horse forward. They galloped up the trail, hooves thundering on the frozen ground. Each bend in the path seemed to take forever, each rise revealing more of the ominous smoke cloud. Finally, they crested the last ridge. The sight below stopped their hearts. The barn was engulfed in flames. Ranch hands ran back and forth with buckets, trying to contain the blaze. The wind carried the sounds of shouting and the terrible crack of burning timbers. They rode hard into the yard, sliding from their saddles before the horses fully stopped. Old Nate ran to meet them, face black with soot. "Started just after dawn," he panted. "Found oil-soaked rags in the hay. Most stock was out, but—" He hesitated, glancing at Luke. "But what?" Luke demanded. "Your mare, Shadow. She was in her stall when it started. Got her out, but her legs are burned pretty bad." Luke's face went white. Shadow was his prize-cutting horse, bred and trained by his own hands. Without a word, he strode toward the small crowd gathered near the water trough. The black mare stood trembling, sides heaving, while one of the hands bathed her scorched legs. She turned her head toward Luke's voice, nickering softly. "Easy, girl," he murmured, running gentle hands over her smoke-stained coat. The burns weren't deep, but they would take weeks to heal, if infection didn't set in. Mabel appeared at his side with clean cloths and a pot of honey from the kitchen. "Mama used this on burns," she said quietly. "It helps prevent proud flesh." A shout from the ridge drew their attention. One of the younger hands, Tom Wilson, rode in hard. "Cattle scattered clear to Thompson Creek," he called. "Found cut fence in 3 places. Must have happened during the fire." Luke's expression hardened. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. While they'd been in town, Rusk's men had struck at everything he valued. His barn, his horse, his herd. "How many head missing?" he asked. "Can't say for sure yet. Maybe 40, 50 head. In this weather, they could be anywhere in those hills." The barn's roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a fresh cloud of sparks skyward. The hands redoubled their efforts with the water buckets, trying to keep the flames from spreading to the nearby structures. Mabel touched Luke's arm. "What can I do?" He looked down at her, seeing the same determination he felt. "Help Nate get a meal together for the men. They'll need hot coffee and food soon. Then we'll see to Shadow's legs properly." She nodded and hurried toward the house. Luke turned back to survey the destruction, his jaw set in a grim line. The barn could be rebuilt. The cattle could be gathered. Shadow's legs would heal. But this attack meant war, and he needed to be ready for whatever came next. The hands worked through the morning, finally beating back the flames until only smoking ruins remained. The December wind whipped ash and embers across the yard, carrying with it the acrid smell of destruction and the bitter taste of vengeance. Luke knelt beside Shadow's burned legs, carefully applying more of Mabel's honey remedy. The mare's soft nickering tugged at his heart. He'd raised her from a foal, trained her himself. Now her racing days might be over. "She's strong," Mabel said, holding fresh bandages. "Mama always said a good horse had healing in its blood." Luke nodded, wrapping the cloths gently around Shadow's legs. The December afternoon was fading fast, shadows stretching long across the yard. Most of the hands were still out, searching for scattered cattle. "I reckon we should check on Tommy," Mabel said. "He must have heard the commotion this morning." Luke paused. In the chaos of the fire, he hadn't thought about Tommy being in the bunkhouse. "You're right. He usually helps with morning feed." They crossed the yard to the bunkhouse, snow crunching under their boots. Inside, the air was still and cold. Tommy's bunk stood empty, blankets untouched. "Luke," Mabel's voice quavered. "He never came to bed." They searched the small building thoroughly. Tommy's few possessions were gone. His extra shirt, his father's old watch, the book of poetry Mabel had given him years ago. "The kitchen," Luke said suddenly. "Maybe Nate's seen him." But the kitchen was empty, the stove cold. On the rough pine table lay a single sheet of paper, weighted down by a salt cellar. Mabel snatched it up, recognizing her brother's careful handwriting. "Going to finish things. Don't follow." "No," Mabel whispered, the paper trembling in her hands. No, he can't." "What is it?" Luke asked, though he feared he knew. "It's a trap," Mabel said, tears spilling. "Rusk's been threatening him. I know it. That's why he wouldn't come home before. Now he's trying to protect us, but they'll—" She couldn't finish. Luke took the note, studying the hasty scrawl. "When did you last see him in the bunkhouse?" "Yesterday morning, before we rode to town." Her voice strengthened with sudden certainty. "We have to go after him." Luke looked out the window at the gathering dusk. Snow was beginning to fall, thick flakes swirling in the wind. "Too dark now. We'd lose the trail." He met her desperate gaze. "First light, I promise." That night was endless. The wind moaned through the damaged barn, carrying the acrid smell of wet ash. Every creak of the house timbers made Mabel start, hoping it was Tommy returning. Luke sat cleaning his rifle by lamplight, his face grim. Neither of them slept much. Mabel paced, then tried to rest, then paced again. Luke dozed in his chair, rifle across his knees. Outside, the snow fell steadily. Dawn came grey and cold. They moved quietly, efficiently, gathering only what they needed. Mabel packed bread and jerky into saddlebags while Luke saddled fresh horses. The injured shadow watched from her makeshift stall, nickering softly as they led the horses out. Old Nate appeared from the kitchen, carrying a steaming pot of coffee. "Thought you might need this before you go," he said, pouring 2 tin cups full. "Much obliged," Luke said. "Keep an eye on Shadow's legs, clean bandages twice a day." "You just bring that boy home," Nate replied. "We'll manage here." They mounted up, the horses dancing beneath them in the crisp air. Snow was still falling, but lighter now, just enough to dust their shoulders as they rode out. The sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern peaks. Luke led them north, away from the main trail to the mining camp. At Mabel's questioning look, he explained, "They'll be watching the regular way in. We'll circle around, come in from the high country." The snow made the going treacherous. Their horses picked carefully along narrow paths, hooves crunching through icy crust. Mabel's face was set with determination, though her hands looked blue with cold despite her gloves. "He's trying to make things right," she said suddenly, breaking the hours-long silence. "Tommy always did have more pride than sense." Luke nodded. "Pride can make a man do foolish things, or brave ones. Which do you reckon this is?" "Both, maybe." Luke reined in, studying the white-draped landscape below. "Mining camp's just over that next ridge. We'll leave the horses here. Go in quiet." They dismounted, tethering the horses in a sheltered grove of spruce. The snow had stopped, but heavy clouds promised more to come. Luke checked his rifle one last time, then his revolver. "Stay close," he told Mabel. "Whatever happens, whatever you see, stay close." She nodded, her eyes steady on his face. "I ain't afraid." "No," Luke said softly. "Reckon you never were." Together they started up the ridge, the snow muffling their footsteps. Somewhere ahead, through the grey December morning, Tommy was waiting, and whatever trap Rusk had laid would soon be sprung. The wind cut like a knife as Luke and Mabel pushed their horses through deepening snow. Dark clouds rolled overhead, heavy with more storms to come. They'd taken the back trails, avoiding the main road where Rusk's men might watch. Their mounts, though fresh this morning, now showed signs of wear, heads low, breath steaming in the bitter air. "We need to make the camp before full dark," Luke said, pulling his collar higher against the wind. "Can't risk losing the trail in this weather." Mabel nodded, her face nearly hidden in her wrapped shawl. She hadn't complained once, though Luke knew she must be half frozen. The temperature had dropped steadily all afternoon, and the snow was getting worse. They crested a rise just as the weak winter sun touched the western peaks. Below them spread the mining camp, its scattered buildings throwing long shadows across the snow. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and lamplight already glowed in the saloon windows. "No sign of Tommy," Mabel whispered, scanning the quiet streets. "We'll stable the horses first," Luke said. "Then ask around careful-like. Someone must have seen him." They led their tired mounts to the livery at the edge of camp. The stableman barely glanced at them, too busy with his own work to ask questions. Luke paid him extra to rub down the horses and feed them well. The saloon was their next stop. Luke knew mining camps. If anything happened, the saloon girls would know. They slipped in through the back door, avoiding the main room where Rusk's men might be drinking. A girl in a faded red dress was sorting bottles behind the bar. She looked up sharply at their entrance, then relaxed slightly when she saw it was strangers. "We're looking for information," Luke said quietly, sliding a coin across the counter. About a boy who might have come through today. 16, dark hair, carries himself like he's older than he is. The girl's eyes darted to the front room, then back. Without a word, she pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket and pressed it into Luke's hand. When he tried to give her another coin, she shook her head frantically and turned away. Luke and Mabel retreated to a dark corner to read the note. The writing was hurried but clear. Rusk took the boy to the assay office. "Watch yourself." Mabel's fingers dug into Luke's arm. "When?" she mouthed. The saloon girl was watching them from the corner of her eye. She held up 3 fingers while wiping glasses. 3 hours ago. They slipped out the way they'd come in. The assay office stood at the far end of the camp's main street, its windows dark except for a faint glow from the back room. Luke led them through the shadows between buildings, staying close to the walls. "What if—" Mabel started to whisper, but Luke squeezed her hand in warning. Voices carried far in the cold air. They crouched beneath the side window. The shutters were closed but not latched, leaving a narrow gap. Luke peered through, then went very still. Tommy sat bound to a wooden chair in the center of the room. His face was bruised, but his eyes blazed with anger. Rusk paced before him, a revolver in one hand and a sheaf of papers in the other. Another man sat at a desk, writing by lamplight. "Just need one more signature," Rusk was saying. "Your sister's guardian now, ain't he? Once he signs these new papers, the whole ranch goes to the syndicate, legal and proper." "He won't do it," Tommy spat. "Not for nothing." Rusk's laugh was ugly. "Oh, he'll do it, especially when he sees what happens if he don't." He gestured with the revolver. "Finish those papers. My boys'll be back soon, and I want everything ready." Luke eased back from the window, pulling Mabel with him. Her face was white in the gathering darkness, but her voice was steady when she whispered, "What's the plan?" Luke glanced around, taking in the layout of the building, the distance to the street, the growing shadows. Time was short. If Rusk's men returned, they'd lose any advantage of surprise. He leaned close to Mabel's ear, his breath barely stirring her hair as he whispered his plan. Her eyes widened, but she nodded firmly. They had to move fast. Tommy's life, and the ranch, depended on what happened in the next few minutes. Luke guided Mabel through the shadows behind the assay office. Their boots crunched softly in the fresh snow as they crouched beneath the back window. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by muffled voices from inside. "You sure about this?" Luke whispered, helping her unstrap the small camp stove and coffee pot from their saddlebags. Mabel's hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "Tommy taught me to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Reckon it'll work just as well to blind a snake like Rusk." They worked quickly in the gathering dark. Luke shielded the tiny flame of the camp stove with his coat, while Mabel filled the pot with snow and added coffee grounds from their provisions. The metal pot soon began to steam in the frigid air. Inside, they could hear Rusk's boots pacing across wooden floorboards. "Your sister's got spirit," he was saying to Tommy. "Maybe once this is done, I'll pay her a visit up at that ranch." Tommy's muffled reply was angry, followed by the sharp sound of a slap. Mabel's fingers tightened on the coffee pot handle until her knuckles went white. "Easy now," Luke breathed. "Wait for my signal." He checked his revolver one last time, then moved toward the back door. The coffee in Mabel's pot was nearly boiling. Luke's knock echoed in the quiet night. 3 sharp raps, then silence. "Who's there?" Rusk's voice was suspicious. "Telegraph rider." Luke called back, disguising his voice. "Got an urgent message from the territorial office." They heard muttered cursing, then footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and Rusk stood framed in the lamplight, his revolver pointed straight at Luke's chest. "Now!" Luke shouted, dropping to one side. Mabel stepped forward and swung the coffee pot in a wide arc. The scalding liquid caught Rusk full in the face. His scream split the night as he dropped his gun, clawing at his eyes. Luke was already moving. He shouldered past the howling Rusk and tackled the second man before he could raise his revolver. They crashed into the desk, sending papers flying. Luke's fist connected with the man's jaw once, twice. The revolver clattered across the floor. "Tommy!" Mabel was already working at the ropes, binding her brother to the chair. "It's all right now. We've got you." Tommy's face was streaked with tears and blood from a split lip. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry. He said he'd hurt you if I didn't help him." "Hush now," Mabel soothed, helping him stand. We know everything." Luke had gathered up the scattered papers, the forged deed, the false affidavits, everything Rusk had planned to use against them. He stuffed them inside his coat just as boots crunched in the snow outside. "Boss?" a rough voice called. "Everything all right in there?" Luke grabbed Tommy's arm with one hand and drew his revolver with the other. "Out the back," he whispered, "quick and quiet." But Rusk, still writhing on the floor, found his voice. "In here!" he screamed. "They're in here!" They burst out into the snowy street just as shadows appeared at both ends. Luke counted at least 4 men, maybe more in the darkness. He pushed Tommy behind him, keeping Mabel close to his left side. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice carrying in the cold air. His revolver gleamed in the dim light from the building windows. The men kept coming, spreading out in a loose circle. Luke recognized them from the saloon. Hard cases, all of them, used to solving problems with their fists or worse. "Drop the gun, Braddock," one of them growled. "Ain't no need for things to get messy." Luke's answer was to cock his revolver with a sharp click. "First man takes a step closer gets to explain to St. Peter why he died for a forged deed and a crooked mining claim." The falling snow caught the lamplight, creating halos around the armed figures. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was Tommy's ragged breathing and the soft hiss of snowflakes settling on their shoulders. Then came another sound, horses' hooves, multiple riders approaching fast from the direction of town. The sharp crack of a rifle shot split the night. But it wasn't Rusk's men who fired. It was a warning shot from the lead rider approaching through the snow. "United States Marshal!" a commanding voice rang out. "Everyone drop your weapons." Marshal Gideon Hart and 2 deputies emerged from the swirling snow, their rifles gleaming in the lamplight. They formed a protective triangle around Luke, Mabel, and Tommy, their weapons trained on Rusk's men. "Much obliged for that telegram, Braddock," the marshal called out, never taking his eyes off the armed men. "Been tracking these boys for 3 days through this weather." Rusk's men exchanged uncertain glances, then slowly lowered their guns into the snow. One by one, they raised their hands. Inside the assay office, Rusk was still moaning, his face red and blistered from the scalding coffee. "Marshal," Luke said, "that man there's Caleb Rusk. He's behind the forged deed and the fire at my ranch. Got the papers right here in my coat to prove it." He kept his revolver trained on the nearest gunman while fishing out the documents with his free hand. The marshal's deputy, a lean man with iron-grey hair, dismounted and began collecting weapons from Rusk's men. The other deputy kept his rifle ready, watching the shadows between buildings. "Tommy," Mabel whispered, squeezing her brother's shoulder, "tell them what happened. All of it." Tommy stepped forward, his voice shaking but growing stronger. "Rusk hired me 6 months ago, said he'd pay good wages for office work, but then he started making threats. Said he'd hurt Mabel if I didn't help him forge documents." He swallowed hard. "The deed's got my signature, but Luke never agreed to sell. Rusk made me write it all out, told me exactly what to say." The marshal nodded grimly. "That matches what we heard from other camps. Rusk's been running this scheme across 3 territories, using threats to force young clerks to fake land transfers." He turned to his deputies. "Get these men secured. We'll hold them in the town jail until we can arrange transport to Denver." The deputies efficiently handcuffed Rusk's men, leading them away through the falling snow. Rusk himself had to be half-carried, still cursing through his coffee burns. "What about the mining claim?" Luke asked, finally lowering his revolver. "Consider it nullified," the marshal said firmly. "I'll send official word to the territorial office tomorrow. Your ranch is safe, Braddock. Though I hear you might need a new barn." "Barn can be rebuilt," Luke said quietly. He looked at Mabel and Tommy, standing close together in the swirling snow. Got what matters most right here. The marshal tipped his hat. There's a line shack just past the creek. Previous owner was a friend of mine. It's basic, but it's warm and dry. Might be a better place to spend the night than in town where Rusk's friends could be lurking. Luke nodded gratefully. Much obliged, Marshal, for everything. They collected their horses and rode through the darkness to the line shack. It was small but solid, with a pot-bellied stove and stack of dry firewood. While Luke got a fire going, Mabel spread out the quilts they'd brought in their saddlebags. Tommy helped arrange their meagre supplies, half a loaf of bread and some cold beef from their provisions. The three of them huddled close to the stove, sharing the food in comfortable silence. The wind whistled outside, but the shack was snug, the quilts warm around their shoulders. I can't ever make it right, Tommy said finally, staring into the flames. What I did to both of you? You already have, Mabel said softly, by telling the truth, by coming home. Luke nodded. Ranch needs good hands who can read and figure, especially now that we'll be rebuilding. He looked at Tommy steadily. If you're willing to work honest, there's a place for you. Tommy's eyes filled with tears. Yes, sir. I'd work day and night to make up for what happened. We'll start fresh, Mabel said, squeezing her brother's hand. All of us together. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, wrapping the little shack in a blanket of white. Inside, the fire crackled, casting warm shadows on the walls as three people who had been strangers just weeks ago sat close, sharing bread and quiet words, becoming family. Dawn painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of rose and gold as Luke, Mabel, and Tommy started their journey home. The air was crisp and clean, their breath forming white clouds in the morning light. Luke led the way, carefully picking the safest path through the deep drifts that had accumulated during the night. Trail's tricky through these passes. Luke called back over his shoulder. Stay close and follow my tracks exactly. Mabel adjusted her borrowed scarf, grateful for its warmth against the biting wind. Tommy rode beside her, his young face thoughtful as he studied the magnificent landscape spread before them. The peaks towered above, their snow-capped summits disappearing into wisps of cloud. They made slow progress that first day, the horses stepping carefully through the snow-filled switchbacks. When the sun began to sink behind the mountains, Luke found them shelter in a protected hollow beneath towering spruce trees. The branches provided a natural windbreak, and soon they had a small fire crackling. Reminds me of our first journey, Mabel said softly as she helped Luke prepare their simple camp. Seems like a lifetime ago now. Luke nodded, his eyes warm in the firelight. Reckon we've all come a fair piece since then. That night, huddled close to the fire, Tommy asked Luke about ranching, about cattle drives and breaking horses, about summer grass and winter hay. Luke answered patiently, sharing his knowledge of the land and its rhythms. Mabel listened, her heart full at seeing her brother's genuine interest in an honest life. The second day brought clearer skies but deeper snow. They had to dismount several times to lead the horses through particularly challenging stretches. By mid-afternoon, familiar landmarks began to appear through the trees, the lightning-struck pine that marked the boundary of Luke's land, the distinctive rock formation they called Eagle's Rest. Look there. Luke pointed as they crested a rise. Smoke from the chimney. Nate's got the fire going strong. The sight of the ranch buildings nestled in the valley below brought tears to Mabel's eyes. Even with the barn's scorched walls, it looked like home. As they rode into the yard, the ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse, calling out greetings. Old Nate stood on the porch, wooden spoon in hand, grinning broadly. Welcome back, folks, he called. Got hot coffee ready, and beef stew's been simmering since morning. They dismounted, stretching tired muscles. Luke immediately went to check on his injured mare in the stable. The horse nickered softly at his approach, her burns healing well under the careful treatment the hands had given her. She's looking better, Mabel said, coming to stand beside him. Another week or two, she'll be good as new. Luke ran a gentle hand along the mare's neck. Thanks to good care and kind hearts. The warmth of the kitchen enveloped them like a blessing as they stepped inside. Lamplight gleamed on the pine table, and the rich aroma of Nate's famous stew filled the air. They shed their snow-dusted coats and settled around the table, passing around bowls and thick slices of fresh bread. After they'd eaten their fill, a comfortable silence settled over the kitchen. The lamp cast a gentle glow, and outside the windows snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Luke cleared his throat, turning to face Mabel. Been thinking, he said quietly. You've got choices now. Can take you into town tomorrow if you'd rather make a fresh start there. Or ... He paused, his eyes meeting hers. You could stay, both of you. Make a life here if you've a mind to. Mabel felt warmth flood her cheeks. The kitchen seemed to hold its breath as she looked around, at Tommy's hopeful face, at Nate's knowing smile, at the home that had welcomed her when she had nothing. If you'll have me, she said softly, her voice full of certainty. Luke's face broke into a wide grin. Well, I already bought you. He paused for effect. Supper, that is. Laughter burst forth, filling the kitchen with its bright music. Tommy's shoulders shook with mirth, and even Nate chuckled as he served up second helpings of stew. Outside, the snow continued its gentle dance, but inside, the warmth was deep and sure, the warmth of family found, of hope restored, of love growing as steady as the seasons themselves. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.